Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are very welcome here. At Christmas time, I love to put collections on my mantle. For a lot of years, I had a huge collection of nutcrackers that I put on my mantle, and I do still love them. But recently, I've been putting trees on the mantle, and I thought it would be really fun to make some trees from inexpensive items, including some items from Home Depot and from the Dollar Tree. Let's go have some fun.
For the first tree, I wanted to make a wood tree with snowflakes on the inside. So essentially a triangle filled in with snowflakes. And the snowflakes that I have here are mostly from the Dollar Tree. I do have one, I think that's from Amazon, but I don't use that one. And these are mostly snowflakes that I already had, and I had used them last year, so some of them you can see I painted, and I didn't end up using those. So the largest ones that I have, you can see they have holes on the top and the bottom, and they were a sort of 3 snowflake garland at the Dollar Tree last year. And then the medium-sized ones I bought this year, and that's a color your own ornament pack. And the very tiny ones are actually stickers, and they come with other stickers. And so what I needed to do was figure out how I could get them into a sort of triangle shape that would fit reasonably inside a wooden triangular frame. Originally, I had really hoped that I would be able to fit them inside the triangle, and I finally gave up on that idea because there was just no way to get these to be exactly a size that would fit inside a wooden frame triangle. So what I decided was that they will overlap slightly on the triangular frame, and that way I can make an attractive tree shape with these snowflakes. So what I'm going to do is double them up. So I'm going to have 2 layers of snowflakes, and I'm going to attach them with little pieces of wire. So I've laid down the snowflakes in the pattern that I'm going to use, and for some of them I could almost snap them together, so they are sort of stuck together a little bit just the way they are. Others aren't. So what I've done is I've cut small pieces of 19 gauge florist wire, and I've laid it across the snowflakes where they are next to each other. And I'm going to glue that down with E6000. And then I'm going to use wood glue and lay a layer of snowflakes on top of this, the exact same snowflakes, so that those pieces of wire are sandwiched between 2 layers of snowflakes. Now, with that all glued and dried, it was surprisingly sturdy. I was very pleased with how sturdy this was. But now I want to build a triangular frame to glue this to. And what I'm using here are these yardsticks from Home Depot, and you can get 3 of these for $1.50. You'll find them in the paint section. So they're mostly straight, but then they have sort of a little indentation at the end so that it's sort of like a handle. So you can get 3 of these large ones, or you can get a 10-pack of the smaller ones for $1.50. So I'm going to take 2, and I'm using the snowflakes as a guide to figure out where to cut this stick. So I'm just using my little saw and miter box to cut that, and I'm going to then also cut the other piece of wood so that I get a nice little point at the top. Now for the bottom, I need to be able to put a base on this tree, or we need to be able to lay this tree flat on a surface if you want for it not to have a little trunk. So the bottom is going to be perpendicular to those other 2 sides of the triangle, but I do need to cut those 2 sides of the triangle so that they're going to lay flat against the bottom. So I just laid the 3rd paint stick along the bottom and marked them and cut them. I then sanded the cut edges and glued that top point together. And then I took this opportunity to fill in the holes on the snowflakes, so I just put a little bit of painter's tape behind each of the holes and filled them in with some spackle. Now I'll say you might want to either spray paint these snowflakes or possibly paint them on one side before you glue them together. Don't paint them on the side you're going to glue together, because once we get to the painting stage, it took me quite a while to paint these. I didn't paint everything until it was completely assembled. You might also wish to paint the snowflakes a different color from the color you paint the frame. So think about that when you look at my final tree. Think about whether you would rather have the inside a different color Or if you like it all one color, I say paint these before you glue them together, or paint them at this stage, or paint them with spray paint. Now with the spackle dry and with the point of the frame dry, I then glued the snowflakes to the front of the frame. And I did trace around them so I knew where to put the glue so that there wasn't just a lot of messy glue that I had to try to clean up. Now for the bottom, again, I want that to be something that can sit flat on a surface, so I wanted it to be perpendicular to these other pieces. So I cut the third paint stirrer yardstick the correct size, so I just measured it against what I had here for the triangle. And then what I'm going to do is take some of these tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree and put them on either side of, I'm going to call them feet of the A, of either side of the feet of the A to hold that in place. So I just measured those because they're a little bit long and I didn't want them extending beyond the edge on either side. I wanted them to be exactly the size of that piece of wood, the feet of the A. So I'm just measuring them and I'm going to cut them as well. And then just sand the cut edges and glue them down, and you can see they make a sort of a little channel for my little tree triangle. And then I'm going to glue the bottom of the tree triangle on the sides where it'll touch those blocks, and also the very bottom, so that it's adhered both to that piece of wood on the bottom and to those little tumbling tower blocks. And then I clamped that, and the result, once it's dry, is really quite sturdy, and it does stand up by itself. You might wish to stop at this point, and I think that you could make different sizes of these and have just like 3 different triangles that just stand on their flat bottom, and I think that would be really cute. I thought that I would try to give it a little base, and so this part, of course, is optional like everything. And I'm very, we'll say, thrifty. I really didn't want to break into any additional wood, so I decided to make the base out of the ends of those paint stirrers, so they are curved. So you'll see how the curve is sort of part of the tree trunk. So the base itself, you can see, is about 3 inches, and then the other 2 pieces are a little longer. I just took, with what I had left over, the longest pieces I could get that were still symmetrical. Obviously, I wouldn't pick something that looked really out of proportion with the tree. I thought that it was a reasonable proportion with the tree. And then again, I used the tumbling tower blocks to attach all of these pieces together, sort of in the same way that I attached the feet of the A to the base piece. And I clamped it all together. And once I unclamped it, it was very sturdy. And again, it stands up really well, so that's great. I took some apple barrel acrylic white paint and I painted the entire thing. And it did take 2 coats, or 1 coat and then some touch-up paint, but I also had to paint it in a few different sessions because I couldn't paint, for example, the bottom of it at the same time that I was painting the back of it, because there's different sides, so something always has to be touching a surface. So it took a few times sitting down painting it, and it was really a pain, particularly to paint the edges of the snowflakes because they're all up against each other, which is why I recommend maybe painting this either with spray paint, if you can get at all the angles with the spray paint, or paint those snowflakes before you glue them together, and be sure to paint the edges. Now, after I painted this, I set it up on my mantel, and I thought the bottom of the tree, the bottom of the triangle, not the bottom of the trunk, really didn't have enough weight compared to the sides. So here it is, completely painted, and I decided I had to break out another pack of those yardstick paint stirrers from the Home Depot and build almost a box-like base around that bottom shelf of the tree. And so I just cut the wood to fit the length of it, plus whatever I needed, the width of a piece of that wood. So I have 2 little pieces on the ends, and then the front and the back cover up the sides of those pieces on the ends. And then of course, after I glued that all together and it had dried, I just painted that wood white as well. And I think that it really did need that extra weight at the bottom if you aren't going to have it sitting on the bottom. And so the disadvantage to this is it does obscure the bottom of the snowflakes a tiny bit. I put it on to obscure the tumbling tower blocks, so that meant that it obscured the snowflakes a little bit too. So I think I would say just look at the way this is configured and make adjustments according to your own aesthetics. So I think if I were making it again, I would either just leave it as a triangle and not give it the trunk base, or I would move this box down a little bit so that the snowflakes aren't obscured. But that's it, it's done. And I think it's a very substantial tree and very pretty with those pretty snowflakes in it, and pretty inexpensive to make. Now for this second tree, ever since I saw these self-adhesive wall tiles that look like the tin tiled ceilings from, I think, 1800s, Victorian era, 1900s, I don't know. I just wanted to make a Christmas tree out of them because I have a metal tree and I thought that I could make something that resembles that metal tree, but with this tile, my metal tree has a marble base, which I really don't like. I really wanted a wood base on this. So we're going to start with one of these, and I took it out of the package and did my best to draw a semicircle at the bottom using a piece of string because I wanted this tree to be tall, so I wanted to use the whole height of this piece of tile. And then I cut the edges off, I guess, so that I have something that will make a nice size cone. And those edges we're going to use later, so don't throw those away. I think I make my favorite tree with those edges. So now, learn from my mistakes. I really did want to be cheap with this, but what I recommend is that you buy a styrofoam cone, a 9-inch styrofoam cone if you're going to cut this the same way I cut mine, and wrap it around the cone and glue it to the cone. You will get a much better shape and it will be much easier to make a cone that way. So I tried to make a cone without putting anything inside, and I struggled with duct tape and glue, and ultimately I cut a piece of pool noodle and stuck it inside. That did help it to keep a round shape, but it still wasn't ideal. Now for the wood base, I just went out to my palette wood and selected a piece that was roughly the size that I wanted. Here is the price you pay with palette wood. Pulling out any nails, or this one had these really long brads in it, so some of them I was able to pull out with a lot of work. Others I had to cut off with my hacksaw, which I don't show here because the hacksaw is in the basement. But I brought it down to the basement, cut it off with the hacksaw. Any that I felt were too close to the surface I filed down, so it was really quite a process getting this wood to be something that I thought I could cut and sand. But then I thought it was about twice as wide as it needed to be for my tree, so I cut it in half. And so I sanded the wood with my mouse sander. I didn't sand it a lot. I wanted to basically just get it clean and smooth. What I really wanted with this tree, which is why I don't like the marble base of the metal tree that I have, is I wanted a juxtaposition between something that's very organic and something that's very designed. And so that's why I left this wood a little bit rough, but ultimately you'll see what I do with the wood. So my metal piece has a seam, a very visible seam down the side, and I felt that the bottom of this piece was a little too rough. So what I did was I just looked for a piece of ribbon, and the color doesn't matter, but this is just a very thin piece of ribbon, which I glued around the bottom and I glued down that back seam. The whole thing is going to be painted, so it doesn't really matter the color of the ribbon, but the size and the texture are something I think that we want to focus on. And then I'm going to be putting a dowel inside the tree and into the block of wood. I wanted a relatively thick dowel. I found the dowel that I'm using in my basement, and I just picked a drill bit that was big enough for me to drill a hole that I could insert the dowel in, and I drilled a hole in the piece of wood. This is a really hard piece of wood. I have no idea what kind of wood it is, but it took me a while to drill the hole, but I did. I got a hole drilled in the piece of wood so that my dowel will stick in it. And then that was really handy for painting it. So I taped off the wood so that I wouldn't get any paint on the wood. And then I painted the tree and the dowel. And the color is the Deco Art Dazzling Metallics in Rich Espresso. I use this color all the time. I think it gives you a beautiful brass or bronze color, somewhere in that range. So you're seeing the first coat here. I did give it a second coat because it's very hard to paint a sort of shiny plasticky surface like this with one coat. I also painted, I don't think I show it here, the inside. That became unnecessary when I added the foam cone, which I will add later. And I painted the dowel as far as I could. Eventually I will take the dowel out and paint the bottom of it. Now after I covered it with 2 coats, I wanted to give it some highlights and lowlights. So for the lowlight, I'm using the Folk Art Multi-Surface in chocolate brown, and that's a sort of metallic looking paint, and mixed with a little bit of the Deco Art Americana Burnt Umber just to make it a little darker, and then further mixed with quite a lot of water. And I just used this at the bottom. I used it sort of anywhere that there was a crevice or a crack. This is the lowlights. I also dabbed it over. And your piece is not going to look pretty when you do this. It's going to dull it down quite a lot, but that's okay because we're going to be adding highlights. Now I was really unhappy with the shape of this, and I thought I'm either going to throw it away completely, or I'm going to see if I can stick a 9-inch foam cone in there, and I could. It was actually almost a perfect fit. When I pushed it in, because I really did want it to go as far to the tip as it could, it's not that pointy, so it doesn't go all the way to the tip. But when I pushed it in, I did open up that seam on the back a little bit, so it required a little bit of repair. I just glued it back down and painted over it again, but it improved the shape of this so much. So that's why I say, just start with this. So I did just have to cut a disc sort of off the bottom of it, and then drill a hole in that for my dowel. And that was fine, that was easy. And then I had to paint the bottom of the cone. I also put the highlights on this. I put the highlights on before I painted the bottom of the cone. So the highlight paint, and I just use the paints that I have, but I do really like them. I mixed that rich espresso with some champagne gold. I felt like the champagne gold on its own would be too light. But I mixed them together, and then I brushed this over the decoration. So that just really brings out the highlights, and then you get something that I think looks a lot more like metal than if you had left it just the one color, which can be quite flat. And I painted, as I said, the bottom of the cone, and I didn't get fancy with that. I just painted it with the original base color. Now, for my wood block, I tried to stain it with a little bit of the burnt umber mixed with a tiny bit of black and some water, and I did like the color that was, but it was far too similar to the color of the tree. This color with a white tree, I think, would be beautiful. But this color with my sort of bronzy coppery tree was terrible. So I decided to paint over that with white, and I thought I can sand it a little bit and get maybe back down to a little bit of that color. So I took some of my apple barrel white and I mixed in just the tiniest bit of yellow paint so I could get a sort of an off-white, and just painted over it. I did try to get pretty good coverage, but I wasn't super crazy about getting into all the holes and getting into all of that grain of the wood because, as I said, I'm going to sand it a tiny bit. So once that was dry, I just sanded around the edges because, again, I really want something which is a juxtaposition of the organic and the crafted. So there, that's that one. Now for the third tree, I thought I'll make a smaller tree that's very similar to that tree. So I'm using this tile decal from the Dollar Tree, which is white with this beautiful gold pattern on it. I'm using a 6-inch cone. They're called by numbers, number 9, number 6, but I measured them. That seems to be the size in inches. And then I just rolled this around the cone. So a lot less measuring required. Now it doesn't fit all the way around the cone, so I just took a piece that I had cut off and sort of matched it up at the bottom and glued that on. I also took some leftovers and glued them to the bottom of the cone so it would be completely covered. And it's not perfect on the bottom, but I don't think you're really going to be looking at the bottom. Now I have this clear candlestick from the Dollar Tree, and I mixed some Mod Podge and some white paint, and I painted that over the candlestick. In the past I've done this in 2 coats, Mod Podge first, then the white paint, but I find it works pretty well just to mix them together. And you don't see the second coat, but I did 2 coats of that. And I also did the inside of it because I think that's helpful. If you do miss any little spot on the outside, then the inside white paint will show through. Once that was dry, I took my Deco Art Rich Espresso paint and I just painted where some of the decoration is on this candlestick, so just some stripes around it so that it better matches the tree. And you could Mod Podge over that if you want to seal it. I don't show Mod Podging it here. Now this tree I felt was just a little too plain, and honestly if I had like a gold bead fringe, I think that's what I would have put around the bottom. I don't have any gold bead fringe. If you like this tree and you have gold bead fringe and you make it, I would love to hear about it. I think it would look better than what I did, but I don't hate what I did. So I had these gold ribbons. It looks like they're from Target. I must have bought them a while ago. And I took a thin white one. I wanted to put something around the bottom to hide that seam between the bottom of the cone and the top of the cone. But I also decided I would put pearls around the bottom, and I thought this would ground the pearls. So I put this white ribbon around the bottom and I just glued that on with hot glue. Then I glued the tree to the candlestick, and as I look at it, I probably should have left it just like that. But what I ended up doing was gluing pearls around that ribbon at the top of the ribbon, and I just varied the size of the pearls as I went around. So I put a very large pearl on the top, which makes it look like a clown hat in my opinion, and then I put sort of a small but larger than the pearls on either side of it pearl in the middle, and then smaller pearls on either side. And I couldn't decide whether to keep going around or not, but I decided to go all the way around. So I have 3 different sizes of small pearl going all the way around. You'll see that in the finished tree. I didn't show it here because I couldn't decide whether to leave it that way or not with just the 3 or 5 pearls. Now, the final tree may be my favorite. When I had those leftover pieces of the large sort of faux tin tile, I decided I would really like to put those in the middle of a tree shape. So I went to the Dollar Tree and they did have this wooden tree cut out, which is meant to hang. So it's got a little hole with some twine through it at the top. But I thought that I would love to make this into another tree. So it's going to need a little base so that it can stand up. So I made a base out of 3 pieces of one of these yardsticks. And I cut them, it looks like they're about 3 inches. I tried to choose what I thought would be wide enough to be a nice stable base for this tree. And then I cut a little slot in it that I'm just going to put the trunk of the tree in. So I cut a slot in both of these pieces and I cut them together to start so that the slots would be the same size. And then with my little saw, I just cut down as far as I could with the saw, and that way they were a uniform depth as well. And then I just used my knife to poke out the piece that I had just cut for the slot. That was pretty easy. And then I just cut a little piece. This was another just little piece. The size is based on what I had left over. Little piece to go in the back to give it a little stability, although ultimately I decided I thought it looked better in the front. So with the tree itself, I just filled in the hole with some spackle and I glued my tree base together, and then I let everything dry. And then I decided to make a sort of little template for the tile that's going to go on the inside. So I just used some scrap paper and I cut it out. And then when I taped it to the 2 pieces of tile that I had left, and you can see I've taped those together to get a triangle, it was a little too big. So I ended up cutting it a little bit smaller. So we had to work with both these things, but it's basically the shape of the tree. So it's inset, and then it was time to paint everything. So I mixed a little bit of yellow into that mixture of white paint with Mod Podge that I already had, because I thought that might stick better, and I had it left over anyway. And I painted the tile. And then for the tree, I painted it my burnt umber with just a tiny bit of black mixed in and a lot of water so that the grain of the wood, such as it is, shows through a little bit. Now with those pieces of yardstick, they do have numbers printed on them. They do have measurements printed on them. They are actually yardsticks. So I made sure that was on the inside because that does show through a little bit. So I painted that on both sides. And then with the tree, you can't really tell on video, but I felt like I had put too much yellow in the paint. So what I decided to do with the second coat was to paint over it with white, but to not be too aggressive with that paint. So a little bit of that off-white color is showing through. And then the final step is really simple. I just used some white glue and made sure that it extended all the way to the edges of my tile and just glued it to my tree and stuck it in the stand. And I really do love this tree. It's very simple, but I love the way it looks. This is another one that you could easily make trees of different sizes. You would just need to find other wooden cutouts of trees in different sizes, which I don't think would be that hard to do, and just paint some tile and glue it on. Very simple to make. Now these final trees are just a bit of fun. I thought, what can we make with some pool noodles? And so I took some pool noodles. I have white and I have green, and I cut 1-inch discs out of them, and I just arranged them in a tree shape and glued them together. And they stuck together pretty well. And honestly, just like the other tree, I kind of like this just as a triangle and just plain. Now I do more with it, but you can of course do whatever you want if you decide to make these, and maybe you'll have much better ideas than I did. Now, one reason that I wanted to make this with pool noodles is, first of all, it's really inexpensive, and second, I did think it had a sort of a modern look or a contemporary look to it. It's very abstract, but also because it's very sturdy. So if you make a whole bunch of pool noodle trees and put them somewhere, and you have small animals or small people, as long as they're not chewing on them, it's okay if they knock them over and nobody's going to get hurt. And maybe they can play with them, put them with whatever scenario they're cooking up. They can fill it with little pool noodle Christmas trees. So I thought they were kind of a fun idea. So I also have these finger shooters, and I cut discs out of those as well. And I thought that they looked kind of fun, these sort of teal finger shooters, inside the hole of these green pool noodles. So I did that as well and made one of my trees of those two colors. Just thought that was fun and different. And then for the third tree, I gave it sort of a white trunk, and then I just sort of arranged the finger shooter pieces around it, but I didn't want it to be too symmetrical. I wanted it to look more like a tree with the branches really hanging down. So that's how I made that one. And for me, I do like things pretty plain. I think for myself personally, I would have left all the trees like this. But I did put some bases on them, so I just cut pieces of foam noodle so that they could stand up and glued them to the bottom of these. And then I even cut an additional piece of pool noodle and cut it in half and sort of wrapped it around that base just to make them a little sturdier so that they could stand up a little bit better. And then again, I liked them plain, but they might be more fun for others if they're embellished. So I bought this foam scatter in the shape of snowflakes at the Dollar Tree. And of course, with anything that's glittery, which these are, they need a coat of Mod Podge to contain that glitter. So that's the first thing I did, is I just covered them with Mod Podge. And then I just tried to figure out what's a configuration that would look kind of fun on these trees. And I went symmetrical with my asymmetrical tree and asymmetrical with my symmetrical tree. And I did end up using just the silver ones. But that's my final tree project, is these fun pool noodle trees that you might like in your decor, particularly if you've got something a little more modern or abstract, or you might like just because they are sturdy and can be played with.
So what did you think of our tree project? I had so much fun making them. I had the idea for this project when I saw this tile at the Dollar Tree, because I thought, I'll bet I can make something that looks like metal. And I have a metal tree very similar to this. So this was really a copy of my metal tree. But the last tree I made was this one. And this, I think, is actually my favorite tree. And I didn't even plan to make that one. And of course, this one, which is actually pretty big. This one was also fun to make, and I do like the way this one came out. If you had a favorite, please tell me in the comments, or if you've made something similar, I would love to hear about it. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.